Good afternoon and greetings from the Library of Congress. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Brent Iacobucci, Acting Director of the Kluge Center. This afternoon's program is being recorded for placement on the Kluge Center website, as well as on our YouTube and iTunes channels. After the program ends, we'd appreciate it if you would complete our short survey. We value your comments, and we use them to maintain and improve the quality of our programs. The Kluge Center was founded in 2000 thanks to a generous donation from philanthropist John W. Kluge. The center is a vibrant community of scholarship on Capitol Hill. We bring together scholars and researchers from around the world to use the library's vast collections and to interact with and inform policymakers and the public. We also administer the Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, which will be awarded this summer. This is the 8th installment in our Pillars of Democracy series, where we examine challenges facing major institutions in American society. The series is jointly sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, the Brookings Institution, and the Kluge Center. Prior discussions address institutions including the US Congress, the military, and political parties. Those prior discussions are available on the Kluge Center website. On May 19th, the discussion will cover churches and other civic institutions, and on June 17th, we will conclude with universities and academia. Today, our discussion will focus on the media. Joining us today are Jane Hall, Associate Professor in the School of Communication at American University and author of the new book, Politics in the Media, Intersections and New Directions, from CQ Press. We also have Marvin Kalb, who has won awards for his foreign policy reporting for CBS and NBC News, and is a non-resident senior fellow with Brookings Foreign Policy Program. And we also have Chris Steyerwalt, former political editor for Fox News Channel and currently a senior fellow at AEI. Our discussion will be moderated by April Slayton, Director of Communications for the Library of Congress. April?
Thank you, Brent. I'd like to welcome our panel today with a challenge. We have about 90 minutes this afternoon to diagnose the current state of US media and then to recommend a treatment plan. It's a challenging case, but I think with the expertise that each of you are bringing to the discussion today, we might make some progress. We encourage viewers who are watching live to submit questions in the chat. We'll get to some of those at the end of the discussion. And to get us started, I'm going to ask each of you, how would you diagnose the health of the media ecosystem as a pillar of democracy today? Marvin, would you like to get us started?
It would be a pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm happy to discuss this subject. I think that journalism today is in a very troubled place. And I think it's in a troubled place for a lot of reasons. One of them is that within journalism itself, there is a search right now for a new kind of identity. When I first started in this business, we knew what we were doing. We were covering a story. We were there to lay out the facts and then move on. Today, journalism seems to be part that is ripping this country apart. And I would even go so far as to say that in my judgment, journalism today is split along political lines. There is one group, I think led by Fox News, which is attached itself to the Republican Party. Rather than be above it, looking down, it is now part of it. So it seems to me, and I think a lot of other people. And then there's the mainstream media, which I think is capable of judging reality fairly well, being able to present the evidence fairly well, but it is being attacked by the right as being associated only with the left, which I think is simply not true. The largest problem, April, is technology. The technology, the internet, to be precise, has completely transformed journalism. In much the same way that you went early on from the written word to the printed word, we're now in an internet world which is so radically different from what it was. And we now have social media, which in my humble opinion, has fragmented our society in much the same way as it's fragmented our politics, and it has undermined fundamental institutions of American democracy. What do you do with that now? I am not sure. We'll get to that, I'm sure, later on. But what you are dealing with now is an institution fundamental to American democracy, which is itself troubled and split.
Thanks, Marvin. Jane, what would you add to this?
I would say, with your metaphor of the ecosystem, that parts of the reef are dying, parts of the reef are the system are thriving. Some of it is toxic, and it's all interrelated. And then on top of that, it's all interrelated to the democracy. The media are supposed to play a role as a check that's on authority and to report the facts the way I was taught, the way Marvin talks about being taught, the way I try to teach my students today. And yet I believe that the attacks on the news media from Donald Trump are having lasting impact. I agree with Marvin about Fox News. I do not see that as equivalent to any other network in terms of amplifying Trump's rhetoric, amplifying the rhetoric of the Republican Party, having told people relentlessly that the news media are left. It's accepted fact in many parts of this country that the New York Times is left. And when you try to discuss that with people, they're pretty closed to the idea. So the drumbeat, I think, from the right has been very successful. I would agree with Marvin also that the internet has thrown everything up in the air. Social media has been a tremendous force for good in many ways, but it also can spread hate in about 3 seconds. And it is also amplified in ways that I know we'll talk about further. Again, it's a good news, bad news situation with the internet in the sense that many good things have come from that, including an end to top-down communication. You know, an end to a few people determining what the news agenda is. But at the same time, I think we've thrown out the idea of authority and credibility and facts. And I think that you see it in the ownership of the news media, which is another thing I think we should talk about. And I know we'll get to, I think the media are very challenged internally, as Marvin said, as well as externally. And I think we are in difficult times for the news media and thus for democracy. I mean, the two are deeply connected. Polarization in the media is a reflection of polarization in politics, and one thing rewards the other. And we're in a very challenged time, in my view.
Indeed. And Chris, your thoughts?
Well, I think people thought the New York Times was liberal a lot in much of the country for most of the past 100 years. It is certainly true what my fellow panelists say, that Donald Trump was very effective at pointing Republican anger at the mainstream press in ways that were very helpful to him. That is certainly true. But he was dealing with a pre-existing condition on the right of a deep contempt for establishment press in the United States. We can think back to 2008 and Sarah Palin. Republicans didn't know anything about Sarah Palin except for that the New York Times hated her, and they probably thought that was a good sign. They probably thought that was okay. The transformation of the news business in the 1990s, first with the arrival of cable news, the change in talk radio, but most importantly, the internet, destroyed a consensus that existed in the bubble that had occurred in the United States after Pearl Harbor, where aspirational objectivity in reporting was lived happily with a business model that was based on reaching the broadest audience possible. We can think about how when Marvin was getting started, people didn't know who was out there listening. There were only 3 networks and maybe public broadcasting. People didn't know who was out there listening. So to get the largest share of the audience possible, you had to appeal to a broad audience. You had to get Republicans, you had to get Democrats, you had to get a little bit of everybody. So you had to preserve that. Where we are now is that the local press has substantially died as a force. As a result of the arrival of the internet by 2005, it had pretty much wiped out that feedstock for our understanding. And then national media outlets figured out that in this atomized space, you have to have a high emotional attachment, high emotional saliency with your audience to keep a loyal audience in a fractured space. So when you got 3 networks, 2 main newspapers, and a couple of wire services that are running the discussion basically nationally, it's a lot easier to reach consensus. When you've got hundreds of sites and all of these outlets looking to hold on to their narrow slot, what they've got to do is flatter their audience, tell them what they want to hear in order to keep them and to stay profitable. And it is a serious, this siloing that isn't just partisan siloing, but is subgroup siloing within the parties for different affinity groups, is causing us serious problems. And if we're not able to have a normal conversation about the problems facing the country across different groups, we will never solve the problems facing the country.
Chris, you bring up a good point about how the media has evolved from kind of World War II to the present time. Marvin, what are your thoughts on sort of these evolutionary changes that have brought us to where we are today?
Well, April, we touched on a major change, and that was the internet. But Chris takes us back to World War II. I would go much further back than that. Journalism has been a part of the American democratic system from day one. But as we went along, parties owned different news organizations. And then by the mid-19th century, independent, quote unquote, news organizations were established. Either rich people or groups came in and owned different parts of it. The central issue in terms of my time, anyway, which I admit goes back quite a ways, but the central issue was, Chris used an interesting phrase before. He was describing journalism as appealing to an audience. I have to tell Chris and anybody else listening or watching, it was not my job to appeal to any audience. It was my job to cover the news. And when I was hired by a guy named Ed Murrow, Murrow was the one who, by his definition of democracy, gave us a sense of the importance of journalism. And it was not to become part of a fractured society. It was somehow or another to look at that society, to come up with your best judgment about what was happening at a different time, try to explain it in terms of today, make your audience understand things. I really find it a very distant concept to think about appealing to an audience. You had, at one point, a fairness doctrine, which was set up in law to oblige the journalism business to be fair to all sides. And so even if we didn't want to be fair, we were obliged to be fair. But then, and here is a political statement so stated, the editorial in me is saying that the right wing is free to give the fairness doctrine so that there could be, in the post-Vietnam period, a feeling on the part of a chunk of America that they were not being given a fair shake during the Vietnam War, that the liberal press took over the coverage of that war. It wasn't the military, it wasn't bad judgment on the part of the White House. No, it was the media, left-wing media, liberal media, whatever phrase you like. We never had that kind of power. We were telling you from Vietnam what it is that was happening. It was a war that was being lost right in front of our eyes. And as journalists, we were simply covering that and telling the American people about it. But a chunk did not believe it. And that gave birth really to a very strongly conservative radio operation. And that led ultimately into Fox News, which has been phenomenally successful because the audience is there. There are many people in America who feel wronged and that they feel that Fox is righting the situation. I don't, but that's not important. What is important is that the press now is part of the political warfare in this country. And that is what makes it such a painful discussion. Thanks.
Jane,
I'd like to agree with Chris and Marvin, if I can.
Yeah. No, absolutely, Jane, please.
Well, you know, there are a couple of things I think, I do think, being from out of town, being from a small town in Texas, I mean, I think there has been an elitism in the media. That doesn't mean that the news media headquartered in New York weren't able and aren't able to report. I mean, Trump was tapping into disconnect. It was globalization and also, I think, elitism, and so was Roger Ailes. But I think we cannot forget media ownership. You know, when I was growing up, you know, the great era of broadcast news was what I watched, and the agenda setting regarding the civil rights movement would not be able to be duplicated probably today, although certainly George Floyd spread in a different way. So I don't pose that one thing was good and a new thing is bad, but the concentration of ownership that has been allowed, you know, what I recall is that when I was a very young journalist, former president of CBS News said that we needed to differentiate between what the public needs to know and what they want to know. And way back when the broadcast networks were making so much money on entertainment that news was what they talked about as a public service. I know Marvin will agree with me on this. And so, you know, the idea that the public owns the airwaves, according to the 1934 Communications Act, my students have no idea because the media are so heavily concentrated. Sinclair owns something like 40% of the radio stations. I think you have to also talk about the deregulation of the media and the lack of accountability for serving the public interest. I mean, that is to me a parallel strand that goes right along with what's wrong. I mean, you have capital companies buying and selling newspapers for the parts and tearing them apart, selling them, you know, like they are not part of the public trust. So I think that the commercial nature of our news media and the deregulation and the concentration of ownership are really factors that, along with everything else, should be talked about.
So given everything we're discussing now and looking at where we have come from and where we are now, what do you think that the media landscape should look like when considering its role in supporting democracy and in that public service vein? How can media maintain its relevance with audiences who are particularly younger generations? They connect quite differently with the world, and you know, they're looking at media in a different lens. They're getting their news from different sources. What are the next steps? What are the solutions? What's the treatment plan?
This idea of aspirational fairness has been rejected by the left and the right in large swaths of the American news media today. Advocacy journalism quickly morphs into telling people what they want to hear and flattering them to maintain these audiences. And now, thanks to market research, outlets know who their audience is. They know who's out there. They know who's listening. It's not tapping on the wall like it was when you were doing broadcasting. This is narrowcasting. And if you know who your audience is, you're going to need to give them what they want. As I tell people, the difference between news and entertainment is sometimes I have to tell you what you don't want to hear. And in what, once it was revealed that the news could be profitable and was not an eleemosynary activity, that something to be done for the use of the public airwaves. Once we went off the airwaves, right, and it was revealed that the preposterous idea that somehow a 24-hour cable news channel could make billions of dollars for people watching the news, it wasn't that people changed their attitudes about the news. It was that what was being presented was changed. And it was being presented to them in a way that affirmed their biases, flattered them, and made them feel better. The problems we have are demand side problems. The problems that we are experiencing right now, we live in a country where more than 54% only 54% of adults over 16 and over can read at a 6th grade level. We have a shocking problem with literacy. We have shocking problems with civics education. We have shocking problems with knowledge of American history, things that are only going to get worse as we politicize even more deeply classroom discussions about American history and civics. So we have a demand side, we have a serious demand side problem that no matter whatever happens externally, the people who want to make a living off of ignorance, and the people who want to make a living off of hatred, and the people who want to make a living off of division are going to keep showing up and doing it. I have often made a comparison between nutritional problems and media problems and news problems. We are in an era of nutritional diabetes, lots and lots of empty calories, but low nutritive value as people consume more and more information, but less of it equips them to be good citizens. Less of it equips them to be part of the American experiment. And that's the real problem. So I think we have to talk, if we're going to be, to be clear-eyed about this, we have to talk about this as both a demand side and a supply side problem.
Jane, what do you think about how we get people to eat their vegetables while they're consuming mass quantities of dessert in the media?
Well, I'm not as negative on, but negative's not the right word. I'm more hopeful. I mean, I think there are hopeful signs. Whatever you think of the reporting by the New York Times and the Washington Post and other so-called mainstream news media, because they've moved into digital and because they've adapted in the ways that include having podcasts and a lot of other ways, they are expanding their audience. I think we have just seen on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC, the media demonstrating what they are licensed, however, not licensed, but what they are supposed to be doing. You see people knowing and noticing that quote unquote reporting, straight reporting. I mean, I believe there's an appetite for non-punditized, non-confirmation biased news. I mean, there's got to be. I think we probably need more explainers of major things, which you do see some news organizations doing. Chris is right. There are also a huge number of non-voters in this country. But I have seen signs recently, for example, that the accountability and the trust in the news media, obviously trust is down, but recently there have been some surveys that have shown that people of both political parties, that their trust or their sense that we need the news media, in some ways there are some hopeful signs because of the coronavirus, I believe, and also I hope because of the media coverage that has been happening around the war in Ukraine and international news. There's some sense that people may realize that the news media do have a role to play, that mainstream media can play a part. Certainly, I don't think it's fair or accurate to say people should sample a whole bunch of news. I don't think that's something that we can expect. But I do think there are some hopeful signs. I do hope that our politicians can join in, although they are being rewarded for not. We may need to change our primary system. We may need to look at other things in politics that make the Democrats and the Republicans go after something in a congressional hearing that they then fundraise around. I mean, that is not necessarily the media's problem. So I'm a little more hopeful. And I think the news media in this country have something they are supposed to do. I just believe that in my core.
Marvin, Jane mentioned the war in Ukraine, and given your history and experience covering war, do you have thoughts around how that has changed and how it compares to maybe the historical moments and maybe how it offers some hope for the future of media and journalism coverage?
Right, well, 3 quick points then. I think some of the coverage of the war in Ukraine has been absolutely first class. Journalists who are not necessarily war correspondents have gone into danger zones. They have jeopardized their own lives, but they did that for a purpose, not just to get on the air. That's the end result. That's fine, get on the air, but what are you saying? What are you conveying? And I think in the conveying of news from Ukraine, the three networks, the cable operations, and probably others that I'm not familiar with, certainly the newspapers and all, they have done a wonderful job, and they have demonstrated what Jane was just saying, that there is a need for that kind of reporting. Somebody can then do a great analysis, but what is the analysis based on? It's based on hard news reporting. It's somebody sitting there looking, hearing, and conveying as accurately as possible what is actually happening. So that's a terrific thing, and it demonstrates to the American people that when things are bad, when there is a huge story, you can depend on all of journalism to do it, because there is a core belief in American journalism that we have a responsibility to convey information to the public so the public can make up its mind. That was the whole original idea, and it still is that idea. Second point, when you are covering, let's say you're covering a war, I don't want to get too personal here, but you're covering a war 40, 50 years ago. You're in Vietnam. You do not have instant communication with your audience. What you have, again, your eyes, your ears, your typewriter, you write a story. We then had to get the copy to New York, along with film that we were shooting, let us say this afternoon. It would take about a day before the film would get to New York. Then it would have to be cut. Then the person in the field would do a voiceover. That person had about 48 hours to think through what it is that he or she was reporting. Meaning it is not as today when it is done live. When Ed Murrow walked out of Buchenwald in April of 1945, what he saw in a concentration camp so overwhelmed him, he could not broadcast that day. He could not broadcast the next day either. It was the third day out that he felt he could find the words to convey the reality of the horror of what he had seen. Today, a reporter would go in with a crew and instantly express what it is that she saw, heard. Could you really do it as well? Some journalists do. Some are really terrific at that. In my judgment, most can't. Most could have used some time, but today in journalism, you don't have time. You have to get out there and say things, whether you're convinced it's right or not. And that hypes things, that distorts things. And if every now and then, unfortunately too often, people are dissatisfied with what they see on television, read in a newspaper, I understand that. I understand that today, if you pick up a newspaper, even the best, within a paragraph or two, you know pretty well where the reporter is coming from and where he's going with that story. We didn't decades ago, truly, we did not. We were not appealing to anyone. We were trying to tell it straight. And today, that's what I meant at the very beginning, saying we're in troubled times. We are. If one of the institutions of our democracy is the press, and it is, no doubt about that. If the press is not above the scene, looking down as best it can, all of the things that Chris was talking about, right on. But we also have that responsibility, because the news can only come from the journalists. If it's made up, it's propaganda. I mean, Putin has that. I lived in Russia for 5 years covering that story for CBS. And I can tell you, we used to get advisories that came in from the boss at CBS saying, he is prepared to miss a story But please, all of you out there covering stories, get it right. If it takes a little bit of time, sit there and get it right. And I think that we need somebody today to tell us, one, that journalism is essential, important, and to be respected. And second, give it the money that it needs to do the job well, and then get out of the way and let the reporter do the best he can, she can. Thank you.
Well, and thinking about that next generation of journalists and reporters, they're facing a very different situation and experience with social media and expectations that they be there as well as in the traditional media outlets where they're starting their careers. Chris, do you have thoughts about sort of the challenges facing young journalists and the opportunity to sort of think differently about the role of social media as they're covering the news?
Well, I think first and foremost, I would say never tweet. Never tweet. Look, the breaking news, the immediacy of Twitter, the dopamine hit that Marvin is talking about, this feedback from instantaneous connection, instantaneous reporting. Here it is now, click, click, here it goes, and out the door. But I will note that the outgoing executive editor of the New York Times, the incoming head of news for CNN, and an increasing number of people are pointing out a truth, is that Twitter is a big waste of time and it's not real life. It is a fake space that is dominated by journalists and elites who preen and pose and perform for one another. As I can tell you that as an editor, I am very lucky now to be a contributing editor at the Dispatch, all hail the Dispatch. But I can tell you that throughout my career at Fox and before, as social media came into it, I would have the opportunity to tell people, why don't you put it in the newspaper? Why don't you put it on TV? Why don't you do that? So I think there was a period of time shortly after the birth of the hand computer and everybody's pocket all of a sudden had the whole world in it, where it was appealing to think about, well, everybody will just share everything all of the time. But I keep riffing on what Marvin said, but it's very true. Digest it, think about it. What's the context? And really importantly, does anybody care or does this matter? There's a lot of stuff that it gets chewed over that is of no consequence, and it doesn't really matter. So take a break, think. It's great to be first. I love to be first as a politics person. I want to be first. I love to be first, but it's better to be right, and it's better to provide your viewer, listener, or reader with the right information, with the right context, as opposed to just splurping it out there so that you can be first.
Chris, you're no fan of Twitter, but that's the news this week. What do you all think about the future of, seriously, the role of social media and its intersection with, we talked about ownership of media outlets earlier. Now the conversation is extending into those social media spaces.
Well, you know, I think that first of all, it is terrific that editors have begun to say to young journalists, although a lot of people who tweet are not necessarily young, but some of these are somewhat generational, to say, let's be sure we have it right. And also let's put it in the paper and let's not be under pressure to tweet. I think we got into a situation, you know, where they're kind of trying to put the horses back in the barn, to use an old country analogy, to say you don't want to tweet right away. I mean, it is true, journalists are reading each other, and the tone, several studies have shown that the tone of political reporting in many ways the tone in Twitter got snarkier. So I think it's good that there are some countervailing forces. There are people saying, wait a minute, let's pull back. Let's go back to the idea of getting it right. I mean, I don't know anybody who would say they want their journalists to get it wrong. I will say that journalists that I am teaching need to know how to do all of these things. You do not have the 3-camera crews, so they have to come out and they have to be able in the beginning to probably shoot video, audio, and all of that, but that's different from stating their opinion on Twitter. So that's one part of what I would say. On Elon Musk, to my mind, the idea that he has bought Twitter, which I do think is more of a force than maybe Chris. It's not only journalists, but I do think it's a lot of elites as well. But the idea that that's probably going to sail through, to me, is a striking example of a whole bunch of things. The lack of Congress looking at social media, knowing how social media operated. I mean, you had that Facebook whistleblower who taught them what Facebook was doing, what Instagram and Facebook have been doing to our young women in terms of their body image and algorithms. So I think Congress was asleep on this. Europe is ahead on this. I'm not saying we need to regulate the internet. I don't know exactly how, but Musk is coming in and saying it's an unfettered town square, which has led to a lot of abuse of a lot of people. He's even calling out his own executives. And I think that it's a false metaphor to say it's going to be unfettered speech. We already had that and had a lot of disinformation. So I find it a troubling trend, mostly because how is it that the world's richest man, has 80 some odd million Twitter followers, is able to come in and pretty much buy this asset without anybody looking at it? And how are the media companies able to own the concentration that they do?
Marvin.
Yeah, well, you know, rich people, Jane, as you know, have been buying up media for a long, long time, way, way back.
Right.
Rich people will come along. And in Hearst's case, for example, toward the end of the 19th century, you would almost generate a war because you thought it was good for business. That is not the issue in my mind. It's not that rich people will come in and buy things. If you come in and buy, for example, you buy the Washington Post, right? Bezos buys the Washington Post. One of the first things he did was to pump a couple of $100 million into the paper, hire more reporters, get better editors, and the paper today is actually better than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago, in my judgment. The problem comes in with somebody like Musk, not only owning the property and becoming a public property, it is for him a private property.
Right.
That he can do with this power what he chooses to do. And according to today's paper, 2 of the people who worked for Twitter are soon going to lose their jobs because he doesn't like them. That is a danger, such as you're pointing out, that we all ought to somehow or another, one, become aware of, and then ask ourselves, what are we going to do about that? And there we all, I suspect, all of us run into a stone wall. There would be a wonderful way of saying, let's get only good rich people to buy a newspaper and network.
Well,
that would be wonderful. I don't think that's going to happen. Maybe it would. It would be great. But we have to find a mechanism, whether it is part government, and that has been advanced, by the way. That has been advanced by very serious people, that if the government can sit back, take its time, and come up with a formula that encourages, incentivizes the media to be both responsible and profitable. That's a tough combination.
You know, I want to say that, you know, let me just say a couple of things. I've hit media ownership just because I thought it was a point that needed to be made along with the politics. But, you know, I agree we should incentivize, you know, license renewals. In the olden days of TV stations used to ask people what kind of public interest programming they were doing. And I wrote about the fact that they were counting the Jetsons at the time as educational programming until there was an outcry and hearings. And they pulled back and said, oh, we're going to start to do more. And in fact, they did agree to do more. I don't think I think what's troubling to me about Musk is, is that his coming in there is being applauded, once again, to our point about politicization, it's being applauded by people on the right. Now, you can question whether they should have taken Donald Trump off. That's a whole other political question, but it's being applauded by one side of the political spectrum. And I think it's not even necessarily a good business plan, but it is the fact that one person can buy something and plan to take it apart, tear it apart, to me is a troubling trend. It just is.
Well, it's more than 100 years ago that the American legislature began to think about monopolies, right?
Right.
And then they took action against it. But then they took action against the action against it. And everything is now free of charge and go for it. And I think your point about Musk is very accurate, very true. And I go back to the danger that an operation such as Twitter had even before Musk took over, because there was really a cheapening of language, of thought that went along with Twitter. The whole idea was to take a complicated analysis of politics, of economics, and get it down to a couple of words. Certain things need more time. You've got to think before you talk. And we had reached a point where there was so little talk, so little thought, that the undermining of our system has truly taken place in the last 10 to 15 years in a way that had never happened up to that point. We had our problems before, of course. But what we're talking about with the internet and with social media, and this is a phenomenon that is universal. It's not just America's problem. It's all over the world. Dictatorships can use it to advance dictatorships. In a democracy, it is theoretically not to that purpose that it would be used. But supposing it were, what is it that we are capable of doing to stop Mr. Musk from using Twitter in a way that satisfies his politics, his bank book, but damages the democracy that we're talking about today, and that in this series is going to be discussed from so many different points of view. We're only examining it really from a, quote, media point of view, and the word itself is now dated.
I would only say, if I were worried about the real and disturbing authoritarian tendencies in American politics today, I sure as heck wouldn't give the government more control over the media marketplace. I certainly would not. I just don't think it works. I don't think speech regulation works. I don't think that you can reverse engineer it. Look, the United States, the communication, I think the FCC was founded in 1934. So after the FCC was founded, America found itself still radically unable to deal with radio. Orson Welles' War of the World, to talk about how unsophisticated, think about it this way. The American listening public in 1930, almost no one had a radio. By the end of the decade, 90% of homes had radios in them. It was an upheaval, certainly on par with what we've experienced with the pocket computer and instantaneous news, right? It was a massive earthquake. And we experienced for the first decade much more bad than good from radio. Huey Long, Share Our Wealth, NBC Broadcasting was very happy to give him a platform every week to tell his lies and do his thing. We have research, we have scholarly research that demonstrates the correlation between the success of Father Coughlin in markets and a decreased share of Franklin Roosevelt's performance in the 1936 primary. Radio was bad news. Radio did a lot more for authoritarians in the 1930s than it did for the cause of liberal democracy and freedom. In the end, either we will get better at I have spent a lot of time lately thinking about Abraham Lincoln's Young Men's Lyceum address 23, 25 years before the Civil War. And this is where he talks about our civic religion, that we have the American political system that we have to agree on. This is a speech where he says that we'll either endure forever as a free people or we'll die by suicide. We are testing that proposition very much right now. What is needed is for news consumers and for news producers to understand that what they're doing is in the context of that civic religion that Mr. Lincoln talked about. As I work, as we work, as every young journalist works, it is not just as a journalist. It is an American journalist working within the understandings. And by the way, operating under the gifts of freedom enshrined in the First Amendment, operating under the benefit of the American system with extraordinary freedoms and extraordinary protections, much better than human history ever saw before. We owe a debt to that civic religion, and we owe a debt to that system. And it can't operate in any healthy way separate and apart from that.
Chris, you bring up a question that I've been interested in, which is the role of civic education in our school systems and how we're teaching it in a way that's relevant to a new generation, and the ability to assess the accuracy of information that they receive. That was something that was a big priority when I was in journalism school many years back. And I'm interested in your thoughts on the role of education system, but also the media in making sure that we have a literacy among the public to be able to be part of this conversation in an active way.
I want to say, let me just say also, I neglected to mention, to Jane's point, I learned a lot about robotics and space from the Jetsons. I think there's probably a lot of good insight there. Domestic relations, pet care. Anyway,
right. Absolutely. The cars of the future. I could go with that.
I think
but
all I learned that, and Gilligan's Island taught me everything I needed to know about navigation. I think libraries are enormously important to this. Schools are enormously important to this. Teaching people to be sophisticated consumers, teaching young people that you owe a duty. I think one of the things that we have to embrace anew, is being an educated citizen is your duty as an American. You owe a debt to everyone who has come before you and all of these extraordinary freedoms to be well informed and to participate in our republic in a way like that. So I think holding this forward, not as a cynical thing and not as just a partisan thing, but as an American thing, is crucial. And I think we've got to teach kids about that from the start.
You know, I think that I agree with what Chris has said. I think we can't not put it only on the media. I mean, we've talked about the incentivizing of polarization, and I think that's a very important point. At the same time, I do believe that when I've asked high school teachers, because I have students who don't necessarily know what the ranking member of a committee means. Or, you know, I should play that thing in grade school that we saw how a bill becomes a law and everybody laughs. But there is a lack of understanding. Teachers that I've asked about this say they're under so much pressure to teach other things. So, you know, I'm a big fan of boosting civic education. I think that, you know, the fact that even the presidential debates, flawed as they are now becoming something that somebody's pulling out of. I mean, I think that our institutions in politics and our civic institutions have a role to play. I think educators have a role to play. It's highly regrettable that that's getting politicized, that school board elections are getting politicized because politicians are driving that, because it works, or it may even work in the midterm election. So I think that education is an important part of this. I think that we should reward that. I think that the idea of the obligation of the news media is an important one to stick with. And I do think that people who go into journalism do want to do that. And they need to be taught, and they need to be also in places that spend the money, as Marvin said, and let them do the reporting, let them go off on an investigative piece. I mean, I don't think that most journalists want to be advocates. I think most journalists want to do what Marvin is talking about. It's old-fashioned, but I find it's true among students today. They have to have places where they can publish and do it.
But there's another issue, Jane, which I want to not challenge you on, but seek your advice on, really. And Chris and anybody listening. I agree, as you know by now, that journalism has an almost sacred responsibility to do the right thing to maintain our democracy. Absolutely. And journalists have to be above the political fight, not in it, but above it, and describe what's happening. Let the American people then make up their minds. But this is my question now. If you know that there are any number of political things wrong, you can see them. You can go into a school board meeting and you can see the way a number of people, most of them, I think, representing a very conservative point of view. I could be wrong on that, but let's say, just follow me on this. You have a very conservative point of view that is undermining something that you think is fundamental to American democracy, and you are a journalist. What then becomes your responsibility? Are you going to, no, seriously, are you going to be there and say, I can see this democracy being undermined? I can see it. This guy is saying X, that's wrong. It's wrong, it's historically inaccurate, and it's politically loaded, and it's wrong. How do I write that news story? X stood up today and just gave me a straight Trump point of view. That means the journalist is participating in the political warfare. And that, to me, is one of the worst things that you can do as a journalist. How do you get out of this mess?
Well, the reason I was laughing is I deal with this all the time with my students. I send them to a congressional hearing, and now I've had to say to them, it has gotten more partisan, and when so-and-so goes after so-and-so, I think it was Margaret Sullivan of the Washington Post who coined the idea of a fact sandwich. I could be wrong, but I think you have an obligation to say, as people began to say about the coronavirus or the election, there's no evidence. There's no evidence that this is true. I mean, I don't think we're stenographers. I mean, in some ways, maybe just the facts. I mean, there's a whole debate about that, context to me is also important. But I think if you go to that, you go to the school board meeting, you try to talk to people, and you also talk about, as reporters did, critical race theory is not actually being taught. You supply the facts, and if it's something from the other side of the ledger, I don't know that I would say this is a conservative point of view. I think that, and I don't want to. Chris will correct me on this, but I think you report what's being said, and you also try to put it in context, factually, without saying this is a terrible thing. That's what I tell my students. Show don't tell. I mean, my God, I am very old-fashioned, but that's what I try to do.
I would agree with that 100%.
Thank you.
And I would say that the degrees to which there was a piece New York Times published front page in August of 2016, and it was a media story. And it interviewed in it. I'm drawing a blank on his name, and he's quite a great writer. But he also interviewed the politics editor for the paper and talked about basically this: Donald Trump is an asymmetrical threat. So isn't it time that we respond in an asymmetrical way, right? Mm-hmm. He lies, he does bad things. Here we are shackled by our journalistic ethics and prevented from engaging him in a way that would be more effective, and wrote the piece. And it was sort of a cue, and it was more reflective of a change in the thinking overall. And I think, by the way, there was a decent amount of shame on behalf of CNN and others, MSNBC and others, that had given Trump such a robust platform and paid so much attention to him, and it facilitated him so richly when they thought he was going to hurt the Republicans, not be the nominee, and not be in a close race with Hillary Clinton. So anyway, the published piece, and it says like, maybe it's time we take the gloves off and really let it fly. So everybody started taking the gloves off and let it fly. You know what it did? Nothing. It helped Trump because he was able to say, here they are, the enemies of the American people. They're coming after me. All they do, and they announce it on the front page of the New York Times. The thing, when you are dealing with people of an authoritarian tendency like Donald Trump, when you are dealing with people who would happily wreck the concord, that would happily wreck the consensus that we have worked so hard to build in the United States for their own narrow gain, not even for the partisan gain, for an individual's gain. When you are dealing with a person like that, you must revert to first principles. You have to do the best kind of journalism. You have to be more scrupulous. You have to be less opinionated. You have to get the facts. You have to show them. It's not enough just to say, well, this guy's a big liar and we don't like him and he's a bad person. You got to rigorously keep reporting, and you've got to do your thing, because once you get sucked into the space with a person who does not have a regard for the truth, once you've been sucked in that space, you've lost your only advantage. You've lost the only advantage that you've got, which are the facts on your side and the information that you can marshal.
There's a lot of incredibly interesting conversation to be had in this space. I'm going to go to an audience question that I think dovetails just with this very thread of conversation. And for those who are watching live, please do feel free to put your questions into the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. One of our audience questions is, are presidential debates dead, or will they be resurrected, or should we even care?
Well, they were dead in the 1970s. I believe we missed one turn, 76 perhaps.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Is that right?
That is right.
Yeah, 1976. But we've had it ever since. I participated in one of them. It was tremendously exciting to be part of it. I think it was very exciting for President Reagan. And in other words, I think the political participants gain a great deal from it. Certainly the press gains a great deal from it. Far more important, the public gains a great deal from it, and we should have more of it. The Republican National Committee is pulled out, primarily because Trump felt he was not being fairly treated. I'm not sure that's accurate, but once again, a central point that Chris made before, I just want to attach myself to, because I agree with it so profoundly. When things get nasty, you stick to what is fundamental, and you will end up doing a great service for the country, for yourself, and for that delicate interweaving of the press and the political system. We have been covering politics from the very beginning. The country couldn't get along without us. But we're in deep doo-doo right now. And the way in which we can somehow emerge from it, I think Chris hit it right on the head, that if we stick to original principle, let the journalists cover the story accurately, get as close to the truth as you possibly can, I think we'll all be so much better off for it. But as I say that, I feel that there's a world of reality out there which laughs and says, Marvin, go back to school. It ain't gonna happen that way anymore. We're in a new world. And if we are in a new world and there are dangers to American democracy, are we strong enough? Are we strong enough to overcome the challenge and in a sense come back to fundamentals? That's what I would love to see and believe. But at this particular point, there are so many other reasons that kind of crowd in and make one doubt that we can.
You know, I was just thinking of the moderators of the debates. I don't think, well, I'm hopeful that perhaps there will be a reconsideration of that. If you look at the viewership of certainly Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, but also 2020, I mean, the American public does tune in. They do see the sound bites. They do see the moments. They do say that they help make their decisions. So they have an important role to play. I'm hopeful that they'll come back, but I was just sitting here thinking about something that I should have said a while back, which is I was thinking of the moderators of the debates, and also the need for greater diversity in our politics, in who's on that stage, in who's running, and also who's moderating. We haven't really talked about reaching out to, separate from left, right, conservative, liberal, reaching out to groups that have not been covered. I mean, you could make the case that the old trickle down of the three major networks and political reporting, that's been largely, no offense, guys, white and male. And we need and are seeing greater diversity. I think it should be rewarded. And I think that is also kind of, along with first principles, having more diversity of our stories. Again, it may be a romantic idea. You get different stories, you get different constituencies, conservative, liberal. That to me is a hopeful sign I see in our media and politics, the greater diversity.
I want to fact check myself. Marvin, I put you on a bum steer. I know it couldn't have been 1976 where there were no debates, because that's where Gerald Ford had the massive gaffe where he said there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe.
Right.
So in 1980, though, excuse me, in 1980, there were going to be no presidential debates. And finally, they agreed to do one. And that was the debate. That was the debate that changed the election and won it from Ronald Reagan, because this guy who people had a lot of doubts about and a lot of concerns about came out there, and this genial fellow with nice hair and came out, and he seemed not nearly as threatening and crazy as the Carter campaign had been saying that he was. And that was a pivotal moment. I guess I would just say debates are a product of the television era, and the television era is over. So we're going to have to figure out a better way to do this. Starting in 1960, with Kennedy and Nixon, and the product should always be remembered. The great name that Nixon used, Lazy Shave, was the sort of beard concealer that he was going to use, and ended up looking like he was trying to sell someone a stolen car, and it wasn't great. But the era of television as a unifying force, in 1973, I think, I forget, it's in my book that's coming out, everyone should buy in August. But something like 2/3 of American households were tuned in to one of the three major network newscasts in the mid-1970s every evening, right? That's astonishing. That is a share where you have three hardworking, respected, competitive with each other, but three news organizations that have that much reach to drive the discussion. And by the way, in all those households, what else was there? At least one daily newspaper, maybe two, and also maybe a weekly magazine. We're not here talking about just the elites. We're talking about working class Americans. We're talking about the middle of the middle class was engaged in that way. And that included whether it was Uncle Walter or whichever one of the channels you wanted. That was that kind of penetration. And the debates could do that in that era, but I don't think debates can serve that function anymore. The question for us is, what will we demand? The Commission on Presidential Debates was founded after there were almost no debates in 1980, and now it looks like that consensus is gone. Though I will say, and I'll conclude with this, the idea that the Republican Party, if their nominee going into the general election decides to participate in one of these debates, what are they going to do to him or her? Are they going to take the nomination back? If the Republican nominee says, yeah, I'm going to do this debate, will Rhoda Romney McDaniel come and strip the nomination from them? No, this may end up being a lot of poppycock.
I think it may be, but I just have to disagree with you, Chris. I mean, and I should put in a plug for my book, which is about politics in the media, which is just published from CQ Press. And I use it to teach students in politics in the media. One of the things that I've seen is people seeing the online, maybe they're not tuning in. I mean, this is a debate I used to have with the broadcast networks where they would say, we don't need to cover this anymore, cable will cover it. And also they became a game of chicken between the networks and the political committees, where they were not presenting, nothing happened, and they were being asked to cover 9 hours, all the time. But I had students who like people watching, the Oscars or sporting events. There are people who are watching and commenting and talking to their friends. And, there is an appetite for seeing these bites online. And the viewership, total across different kinds of media is still pretty strong. That's been my experience. And I think, again, it's kind of heartening because that's a good for you thing. That's Brussels sprouts. Before Brussels sprouts got to be cool again. That's Brussels sprouts not tasting good, allegedly.
Well, look, in 2016, I think that Chris will remember and agree that there was a pretty good debate, right, between Hillary Clinton and Trump. And I suspect in 2024, there is going to be a couple of very interesting people running for the presidency. And television has, I agree with you that we're not literally in the age of television as we were. Mm-hmm. Absolutely true. But at this point, there is still a need for something like television to show people what these guys look like, what they sound like, what kind of pressure they're under, how do they respond. There could be a way, perhaps you're asking, how can you think this through? One of the shortcomings of these debates, it seemed to be participating as well as observing, is you don't get enough substance. You throw a question in, the candidate knows exactly what he's going to answer on that, or she. Let me get away from the he, she thing. Whatever the candidate's going to decide, the candidate knows. The second and third question is rarely asked. What about, instead of an hour and a half, what about instead of 1, 2, or 3 debates, have, for example, 6, 7, or 8 debates, but not as long? And how about it focusing on one issue? Mm-hmm. Let us say, for example, the election was for the presidency this year. One issue. What are you going to do as president about Ukraine? And don't talk to me about anything else. That will give the anchor an opportunity to ask the second, third, fourth, and fifth question, and it will put before the American people the candidate who truly knows what he or she is talking about. Then you can talk about budgets in 1/2 hour. Now, I know that the audience is not necessarily going to be there for all of it, but it'll be a front page story in most major newspapers. If somebody says something dramatic about a budget, somebody says we're going to move American troops into Ukraine. It doesn't matter if you got 20% of the American people or 40, 100% will know it very quickly. And if there's a way then of taking the concept of depth, editorial depth, put it into a shorter time frame, and not allow the candidate to wander afield, I think we may be doing a lot of people a good service.
That I agree 100%. That would be far better. I think it's going to be very increasingly hard to get candidates to commit to participate because they are afraid of even modest scrutiny. And one other thing I would add to this, I have been part of a lot of primary election debates. I have written questions for and participated in a lot of primary election debates. And here's what I can tell you. The most important kinds of questions that get asked in the process are adversarial questions from, say, your own team, right? The hardest question for a Democratic nominee to answer is a sincere question from a sincere progressive or liberal who wants to know, can you really do this? Can you do the things that you say you can do? The hardest thing for a Republican answer is a sincere question from a conservative point of view. We are approaching a place, and you will see this with the parties in 2024. I don't know that we will ever see the kind of inquiry when we put Chris Wallace and Brett Baer and Megyn Kelly on a stage to grill Republican candidates like we did in 2016. I don't think we'll see that with either side in 2024. I think the Democrats tried to do that in 2020 to try to clamp down on the moderators and make sure that there were opinion hosts and not news people in as moderation and do that stuff. I think that's a candidate quality question worth considering too.
Good.
I think I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that debate with Megyn Kelly and Chris Wallace was one of the most exciting and interesting things.
It went off in that Cleveland arena like a bomb went off. You could tell that something was going down. That was big time news, and that was, I don't know that we'll get to see that anymore.
Well, on that note, I'd like to give each of you a chance to have a last word and leave our audience with something to think about when considering how the media moves forward and maintains its role in our democracy. Jane, do you want to go first?
Ooh, I was really hoping to go last. Well, I think we've talked about a lot of problems. Sadly, the solutions are not clear necessarily, but I am hopeful about the role of the media in democracy. I think more people than people who do media need to be involved in this conversation. And I would say that I don't know if we're going to be able to put some of these forces back in the bottle, but certainly looking at what are we doing and what is our role, and showing some backbone and saying, we are going to continue to report the facts, or a network that has a particular bias, we're going to have somebody on who's not necessarily from the point of view that we represent. It's hard. It's self-propelling, a lot of this, but I'm hopeful. I mean, I have to be. I teach young people. I'm hopeful about this. They are discouraged. I mean, again, I'm generalizing, but a lot of young people are discouraged about our politics more than our media. I will just say that.
Thanks, Jane. Chris?
Well, first, we have to be confident in the ideas that we carry with us. We have to believe that they will work. And I know that there are a lot of powerful forces arrayed against liberalism these days, right? Arrayed against human rights, arrayed against all of these things. And it can feel very defeating. But we have to remember, these are good ideas that work. They're not just pie in the sky. They are practical ideas that work. The first significant piece of legislation from the first United States Congress was what? It was news business legislation. 1792 and the Postal Service Act was really, yes, it was about postal service, but it was really about what? What was in there? You got to have lowered rates for carrying newspapers so that we can get information up and down the post road. All the first carve-outs for a business were the carve-outs for the publishers of newspapers in 1792. Ben Franklin was smiling down. He had recently passed, but was smiling down, saying his team had gotten one in there. We have always understood that a healthy news business is essential to a healthy democracy. We have a very unhealthy news business right now. And as I said earlier, the news business utterly divorced from our duties and the duties as individuals, but also these corporate citizens. Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Rupert Murdoch, Pinch Sulzberger, everybody, each of them should feel a special duty to the American system and to the principles of our founding and to protecting them. They should feel that. And when they don't, they should be ashamed, and we shouldn't hesitate to shame them for it, because this matters way too much to all of us and to the health of everything to let the news business go so far afield from what it's supposed to do.
Thanks, Chris. Marvin?
Well, Jane and Chris have said a good bit of what I would say. I would just try to branch off at one point. If in fact, and this I do believe, if in fact fundamental to the maintenance of a free society, I want to raise our thoughts and vision just a bit up from that and say that right now there is a war that will determine whether some form of democracy is going to exist in a country called Ukraine. It's a relatively new country. Will it exist? And then you ask yourself the question, what do you care whether it exists there or not, so long as it exists here? My answer is that there is a link. There's a direct link between the maintenance of democracy in a country such as Ukraine and our capacity in Western Europe and the United States, Japan, Africa, Latin America, to maintain democracy in the rest of the world. And right now, what we know about what is happening in Ukraine, we know because of the work of the journalist. The diplomat can do his thing, and the soldier can do his thing. But for the public, the people who are affected by democracy and what it means, they know what is happening because of the work of the journalist. It is fundamental to democracy in Ukraine, fundamental to our democracy here. It is not, as has already been stated amply, it is not at this point a perfect instrument by any means, but it is what we got, and we better make it a more effective instrument for maintaining our democracy, because without it, we don't have democracy. So let's keep our eye on the sparrows fall and understand what is at the heart of the effort to maintain our democracy, and that is the journalist, the juror, the judge. You got to have both systems. You've got to have a free press and a free, virile judicial system, and then we'll be all right. And I have a feeling at the end of the day, we will be. I hope so.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Chris. Your insights have been absolutely fantastic. It's been an incredible conversation to be a part of. On behalf of the Library of Congress and the Kluge Center, I want to thank you for joining us today and being part of this great conversation. I want to thank our audience and encourage you all to take the survey after this program so that we can bring you more programming that is of interest and relevant to your interests. And please join us for our events in May and June. We'll look forward to seeing you then, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.